you for the introduction, Cyrus. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. And thank you to Santa Monica College for inviting us to be here again with all of you and asking us to talk a little bit this time about grief and loss, about how we manage grief and loss in our lives. So I have about a 55-minute presentation prepared for you all and a couple of little activities. The session will be recorded, so just be mindful of that. If you have any questions, feel free you can use the raise hand feature. I'll also be continually asking if anyone has, questions, and we'll also do questions at the end. And I just wanted to acknowledge that I also have some of my EASE staff here, Christina Clark and Evelyn Castillo. You can wave. They'll be monitoring the chat box as well. If you have any particular, it's kind of hard for me to do both at the same time. So that way you can also get questions answered as well through the chat while I'm presenting. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's hope all of this works. Can you see my blue screen? Perfect. Okay. So as we get started, I was asked to talk today about managing grief and loss in our lives. And I'm assuming that that if you're here today, it's because you may have experienced some type of loss or be in the midst or have history with grief and loss, or are working with others that are in the midst of grief and loss in our lives. And I know this can come, things could have happened, years ago, and we may still be struggling with grief and loss in our lives. And so just with that, I'd like to open it up to the chat. If you are grieving the loss of a loved one in your life, I just wanted to give space and honor for those that we have lost, that you may be grieving. If you want to put their name in the chat or what their relationship was to you, and then we're just going to have a short little activity in order to be in presence with that space. And so you can feel free to just type it in the chat who you may be grieving the loss of, or the loss of a loved one for you. And so I'll start. I entered Grandma. Thank you. Thank you, Tracy. I see. Yes. Older brother. Yes. Parents. Yes. So we're seeing things coming through in the chat. Definitely close friends, family, 3 cousins within 1 week. Yes. So you can see, while many of you may not, and feel free to continue writing as needed, while we may not know each other and we are existing together in these boxes today, we do have a lot of commonalities when it comes to in the area of grief and loss. And grief and loss can play itself out in our lives in many different ways. And so with that, I'd like to just kind of create some space and presence. And so I do hope that you use this time together today as just one small piece, one small part of your healing process. And I hope that you don't do any other work today or answer emails or work on anything, and just really give this time to yourself as a gift in your healing process. So with that, I'm going to set up a timer for 2 minutes, and for us to just breathe and to be in presence and to honor the spirit and the lives of those that those or things that we may have lost. So with that, you can feel free to leave your camera on or off, whatever feels most comfortable for you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for sharing, Steve. Good to hear. So one of the things that I like to start with that is to, first of all, to kind of just give honor, but also just to still ourselves and to create presence. One of the things when we are dealing with grief and loss is that, and one of the reasons why so many of us don't deal and work with the grief and loss in our life is because it's hard and it's painful, and they can be very fresh or very scarred wounds in our life. And so sometimes the way that we protect ourselves from this pain is that we create a lot of distractions in our life, and we try to do anything and everything to protect us from experiencing pain. And so that can look like a lot of different things we'll be talking about in some of the slides coming up. So sometimes it's important to develop a practice to just ground yourself and to create presence. 2 minutes isn't really a lot of time, but I don't know if any of you felt during that time like, wow, this is the longest 2 minutes I've ever experienced. And so it really doesn't take a long time, but developing little rituals or practices like this in your life can help you to reconnect with some of that pain, acknowledging that it's still there. So that way it's not kind of avoided and escaped and pushed away. And then it will just kind of slip out and come out in different ways in our lives that sometimes is not the healthiest or the most productive for us or our relationships. So talking real quickly about some of the terminology. So when we look at grief, grief is a natural response to any loss. It's the emotional part of it. It's the suffering that you feel. And the more significant the loss you have, the more intense the grief will be. And so you probably have heard of mourning and bereavement, right? And so these talk about the process of what happens, like how do we realign, how do we readjust to having lost someone or lost something that's significant. And that's a really important point that I wanted to acknowledge, that it's not always about losing a person, a human life. It's also about, it can be losing something, the idea, the concept of something, the dream of something, a change or a shift in a person's life, grieving that loss. Even I've worked with a lot of relationships and a lot of parents, when it comes to the launching phase, and their children launch and go away to college or get married or whatever that might be. And there's a period of grief and loss. We talk about emptiness, but it really is loss, right? And so just reminding us that this is not just the loss of a person in our life, right? It's any type of loss that's significant to us. So mourning and bereavement is it's what you do with that pain and with that suffering. Many different types of loss, like I said, not just the loss of human life, but the loss of a relationship, the loss of an opportunity, the loss of a dream, loss of financial stability, the loss of our health, a major change in our health. A lot of people are struggling with this right now that are recovering from COVID or having some lingering effects related to that or other medical ailments. The loss of that my life is now different and I won't or can't do the things that I did before, right? And so all of those things are losses to us. So it's important to remember and honor those, not just within ourselves, but when we're working and we're in friendship and with our families and relationships. So lots of myths about grief and grieving and what we're supposed to do and what we're supposed to be feeling. This idea that the pain will go away faster if you just ignore it. That doesn't really work, but it's a very common coping mechanism that a lot of people use. So actually trying to suppress and ignore that pain, it just kind of solidifies and hardens in us over a long period of time. And so in order for real healing to happen, that wound that kind of develops scar tissue over it, really just, it needs to be cleaned out. And it needs to heal. So facing your grief and dealing and with the grief will help you through the process. If you don't cry, it means you aren't sorry about the loss. I've worked with so many people that feel guilt, right? And that are just guilt ridden because they haven't cried. What does that mean about me as a person? What are others thinking about me? Because, I can't cry. And honestly, that is also a part of the grieving process. Everybody experiences grief in different ways. And, feeling numb and not being able to experience anything, even, not crying is absolutely normal. So everyone kind of goes through it in their different ways. And it's important also with others in your family and friends and in your circles, not to be judgmental for others and the way that they express their grief. Moving on with your life means forgetting about the loss. And so some people get stuck in grief because they feel, well, if I move on and I'm not crying and I'm not doing all of these things, it means that person didn't mean a lot to me. I'm forgetting about that person. I'm not honoring them in my life. And it actually doesn't mean that. It means that you've gone through the different stages and you happen to be at the acceptance stage. And being at that stage certainly does not mean that you're forgetting the person or your loved one, or that they don't mean anything to you. It's just that you're in a different stage of dealing with that loss. And there's different ways to honor as we go through the stages. So what are some of the symptoms of grief? So it's important to remember that there's emotional symptoms, but there's also a lot of physical symptoms to grief that people tend to forget about. We tend to think of, the sadness, the depression, the anger outbursts, irritability, feeling agitated. Some people feel like they are less tolerant of others, more edgy. But there's also a lot of physical symptoms of grief. And that's why when people get stuck in complicated grief and really haven't taken time to take care of themselves, they begin to get sick because their immune systems are compromised. They begin to develop infections or ear infections or different types of medical ailments when this has been over a long period of time. So some of those physical symptoms could be just feeling tired, lack of energy. There could be like digestive issues. I talked about the immunity, and because of lowered immune system, you tend to get sick more. Variations in weight, gain or loss, just mild aches and pains. Your body just doesn't feel good. And then there's also issues related to sleep, right? And we already know when our sleep is not good, it just kind of plays out in so many areas of our life and leads to many different things. So it might be lack of sleep or just wanting to sleep all the time. And so this is important when we start looking at the difference between, how do we know when this is grief or when this is, something, more serious related to, getting into depression. And so grief should tend to decrease over time in terms of its level of intensity, not to say that it goes away, but the intensity of it should decrease over time. And it will kind of ebb and flow in your life as things happen, as lives happen, anniversaries, the birthdays of your loved one, death anniversaries, those types of things, or holidays. The winter during the holidays is also, we call it the holiday blues. But it's also a time when we mourn and we feel sadness and we feel the loss of the person that we loved during those special times. Depression, on the other hand, is something that begins to feel more pervasive and it's more persistent. You don't have the ebbs and flows of it so much. And really the feelings of emptiness and despair are constant it's almost to the fact where it disrupts functioning, where the person is really struggling to just function on a daily basis. And when something really begins to impair a level of functioning at school or at work, then, you really want to start thinking that this might be something a little bit more that you need some help with. So some of these things are this like intensive, pervasive feelings of guilt, hopelessness, worthlessness, just feeling like you can't function, it's hard to think, hard to move, hard to do anything. And so, or also, thoughts of not wanting to live anymore, loss of hope, or just preoccupation with dying. So when you start, or your loved ones start to experience those types of things, you may want to begin thinking that you may want to start reaching out for some assistance, or looking into your support systems for help. So when we talk about the grieving process, it's very different for each person. It's unique, right? Not everyone is going to grieve in the same way. And this really depends on you. It depends on your experiences. It depends on what your coping skills are, and your life experience. It also depends on your belief systems, on your faith, and also on the nature of loss. Right. And so there's different types of loss. We have, sudden death, where people aren't prepared. And it's something that comes as a shock, and it's scary, and you get the news and you don't really have time to process because it already happened. And so that can be very traumatic and traumatizing. Then you have the other end where you have a person that maybe has an illness, or has some type of a chronic ailment, and you have time to prepare, or to be with that person in the process, or to support them through the dying process, or through hospice, or whatever it might be, which can be comforting to people, but also can be very painful, right? It can be very painful to watch those that we love suffer, right? And so it can be difficult either way. Other things are timing of loss. For some people say, well, for someone that's, older, we know that this is a natural part of life, right? But when we have the loss of a young person, or the loss of a child, or, so that is much more difficult. And also parents that lose children have a much more difficult time dealing with the grieving process, because it just doesn't feel right that parents outlive their children, right? So there's so many contextual nuances that may impact the grieving process for people. So those are some things to think about as you're with others in the grieving process, and that it takes time. It can't be rushed, and it happens gradually. There's not a normal timetable for dealing with grief and loss. You've probably heard of the famous stages of grief, that consist of denial, which is the first stage, anger, second, third, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. There's actually a newer stage that was added. It's not in this graphic, but it's stage 6. It's called generativity, and it's what happens. And it's what happens. It's what happens after acceptance, right? So we have this little thing to remember the stages of grief. It's called DABDAG, denial, anger. So DAB, DA, and the last one would be G, generativity. And the last stage is really like, well, what after acceptance? What does life look like after acceptance, right? How do you begin to create generativity and really heal from the loss? And so, if in the chat, I know we shared a lot about our loved ones, and people that we were grieving. Think about your own life. Where do you think that you're at in terms of these stages? You can feel free to just put the stage number in there. If you feel that you're still, in that anger stage, go ahead and list a 2, bargaining 3. If you feel like you're in a place of acceptance, stage 5. Yes, what is bargaining? And so that's a really good question. Thanks for sharing. So bargaining is when you try to make a bargain If I I will, if I just do this, will you bring this person back to me? If I promise to be there and to do everything, so you try to make bargains that are really, it's saying that you're going to do anything and everything, willing to bring this person back, if only this, right? Or thinking about, if I would have been there, I should have been a better person. I should have, maybe if I would have done all of these things, this wouldn't have happened. So kind of trying to think about options and possibilities. You're not quite there, in really accepting what has happened. So I'm seeing lots of different stages. I see, lots of fours, twos and fours. And I see between stages, right? 3 to 4, I think, I'm not sure. Um, yes, also the idea that we can have multiple losses. And maybe with one particular loss, you feel you're at a stage 5, but with another one, you're not there. You're at a stage 1 or at a stage 2. Floating through all of them, yes, yes, and toggling, right? So that's so important that you're all sharing that, because this is how grief works. It is not, we want grief to be this perfect little linear line in our lives. We want to control the process. But what we know is that that's not how grief works, right? And we don't really have control over how it manifests itself in our lives. The way that grief actually works in our lives looks like this really messy, scribble over here on the right. But if you kind of step back, and look at it, it actually is quite beautiful, the scribble. And what it's really reflective of is that, we are going to go, between the stages. It's not a linear process. One day we may be, go all the way, we may be in acceptance. We may be feeling in a really good place and say, well, finally, I'm getting to this place. I finally have accepted, and next month something may happen. You may be triggered. There may be another loss in your life. And so when we have subsequent losses, not only do you begin to grieve that new loss, but you also grieve all of your previous losses. So everything can get resurfaced for you. When you go through something difficult, it can again trigger. So the idea that you're never fully done, right? And because you don't know what life is going to bring at you. And so things can always, you can always revert back, but that's okay, because you can always move through quickly. And you don't have to, if you go back to the anger stage, you don't have to go through each one of them. And so with each time you kind of revert back to a stage, you actually get stronger and you actually heal more, and you actually get closer, towards acceptance and generativity. Sometimes people, when we look at the process of grief, you have the acute grief, you have complicated grief. And this is when sometimes people can get stuck in this complicated grief stage. So the acute grief is kind of what the normal grief and loss process is, what you normally experience after a loss. And it usually will start dissipating after a couple of months. And usually it has those really intense symptoms, but then it will begin to dissipate over time. Complicated grief is when those acute symptoms, those intense feelings and symptoms don't really seem to go away. It also, people can get stuck in complicated grief when they have multiple losses. So we've seen this a lot during the pandemic. People have had multiple losses within a very short time. It was even shared in the chat box as well. We've worked with families that have had 3, 4, 5 people have lost 3 to 4 to 5 people in their family over a 2 to 3 week period. And so it can be very difficult, and people can have complicated grief because you have multiple losses. And then integrated grief is when you start getting to those later stages. Really accepting the loss and getting into those later, you're able to resume daily life activities, and getting into those later stages. So when people get stuck, it can be really easy to get stuck in complicated grief and really difficult to get out of. So if you know someone, oh, sorry, I just realized that there's a typo in my title. Should read complicated grief. If you or someone that you love or someone that you know is really struggling with those intense feelings of grief and it's been a long period of time, they may be stuck in complicated grief. And so that would be a really good time to reach out to either, support groups or to a professional to kind of help people with that process. So how do we deal with the grieving process? What do we do? Well, we all know that loss and death is a normal part of life. There's different ways that we can. It doesn't mean that we like it or that we're just going to be quick to accept it. It's still hard, right? Even though we know that this is a natural part of life. So it's important to look at your coping mechanisms, to look at the ways that you're coping in dealing with the loss in your life. So starting with acknowledging that there's pain there. And so acknowledging that there's a wound and that there's pain and that it hurts and how you've been dealing with it or not dealing with it. So accepting that grief can trigger lots of different things in our life. I worked with people that say, well, people, call me bitter. They say that I'm bitter, and they say that I'm angry. And really what that person is really wounded. That person has a lot of pain and has a lot of suffering that they have not been able to sit with. And so it's coming out in their relationships, in the way that they interact with others, in their affect, and the feedback that they're getting from others is, you're bitter, you're angry, or you have an attitude, these types of things. So it can really impact quality of life and your relationships when you're struggling with this. So understanding that your process is your own, getting support from people in your life that care about you, being vulnerable. Some of us are not used to or don't want to be vulnerable. We feel like we have to be the strong person all the time, and it's just not possible when you are in the grieving process, if you're going to begin to go through the grieving and healing this process for yourself. And really supporting yourself, remembering that there's an emotional piece and a physical piece, and that you're taking care of both of those. And understanding when it's time to reach out for some help and support. So looking at your support system is so important. For many, this is when their faith-based supports really show up in their lives, and our faith-based, our churches, where there's so many support systems and groups within there. And if that's where you feel that you get comfort from, then that's where you should turn. For so many people, they're like, oh, well, I'll go to my church, or I'll go to my support group, or I'll go to my women's group before I'll go to a counselor. So that is okay if that's what feels good and if that's what feels right to you, but also knowing that there's resources out there. Ease is available. I'll talk with you a little bit more about Ease, but we have telephonic counseling available, and we have short-term counseling available to help people that are feeling stuck or feeling like they just need a little bit of support to get through what they're going through. Looking at your feelings, sitting with them, being creative, trying as hard as it feels, but actually continuing and trying to resume daily routines, getting some sense of normalcy and structure in our lives is actually helpful. Not to say that you're just forgetting, but it helps to kind of get moving and to start helping you to move through the stages. And so when we have children that have experienced grief or the loss of a parent, when we talk with parents, we tell them, they say, oh, I'm not going to send them to school. And then we have kids that are maybe out of school for a really long time. But what happens is that they can get stuck. So actually the most healthy thing that you can do after bereavement time, taking some few days off for bereavement, is to transition the children back into school, into their routines with their friends, with their teachers. That is the healthiest thing in place for them, and leaving open channels of communication. Looking at your physical health, as hard as it is, try ways to get your body moving, right? Moving the energy that's in there, small walks, stretches, these types of things. And planning ahead, um, kind of anticipating triggers that might be coming, so you're not feeling like you are caught off guard. If there's something difficult that's going to be coming up for you, if there's you have to go to a funeral, or if there's an anniversary, or if the holidays are coming up and the holidays are hard for you, anticipate that, so that you're not stuck, you're not like blindsided by it, like, oh, this is that time, I anticipate I may struggle with this, and take better care of yourself beforehand, so that way you can kind of navigate through that time without feeling like you're sinking. Grief is the last act of love that we can give to those that we loved. And when there's deep grief, there was great love. And so the idea that we shouldn't feel shame. We shouldn't feel shame or embarrassed about the grief that we're experiencing. It actually means that we had great love for the person and honoring the person that was lost. So in your life, taking a moment to read, it is in the thorough allowing, it is in the thorough allowing of the grieving process that true healing occurs. So thinking about what that means for you in your process, and the word to really focus on in here is allowing. One of the really difficult things with grief and loss is resistance, right? Escape or avoidance of how we're really feeling, or just because we don't know, if I sit with these feelings, I just don't know how it's going to go. I have over the course of my life, as a younger person, I experienced a lot of grief. I had many deaths in my family, of many different forms, and my family was ridden with a lot of grief. And I learned a lot of unhealthy ways to deal with it, and as an older person, have learned a lot more healthier ways. And I'm still dealing with it. But that word allowing is so important, because until you begin to allow yourself to be with that deep pain and suffering, you really can't begin to heal. I used to think that if I allowed myself to go there, was like opening up Pandora's box. And if I opened up Pandora's box, I didn't know what was going to come out, and I didn't know if I would be able to get out of it. So there was a fear of what would happen, and if I would be able to control myself, and would I be able to take care of myself. And so because of that fear, it really blocked me from healing and from getting to that wound, until I was able to get some support in that area, and do a lot of work on grief and loss in my life. And it slowly began to peel the layers back of my pain. And that's been so instrumental to the process. So think about, for you, how have you allowed yourself to go through the grieving process, or not allowed yourself to go through the process? So a really great way to start on your own, thinking about where you're at in your grief process, is journaling. And so if you can have a paper journal, or a lot of people have their journals on the computer now. And there's a lot of great resources that are out there, but just starting to write what you're feeling down, because as we talked about the ebbs and flows, you won't always feel like this, but in those moments, it's important to give honor to what you are feeling, because that's going to help you on the path to acceptance. And so there's some great resources out there, but these are just some general, like, little prompts that you can use. And I'll share these slides with all of you, so that you can use these or share them with others. but just saying, acknowledging, I am grieving the loss of who, what in your lives. So just writing it down and reading it out loud will help in the process. Today, I remembered, so as memories and thoughts and images, visuals come through your life, what did you remember? Good times, bad times, memories. If I could say something to you, I would say so many people get stuck in complicated grief because of they didn't have an opportunity to say goodbye. And that's a really hard one for people because they felt like I should have said these things. If I would have known, I would have told you. There's so many things I wanted to say that I've never got the opportunity to say. So this is a way to be able to get that out and to put it on paper, and to honor it and to kind of put it out there, because so that it doesn't stay locked up inside. The things that help me most right now are, this is really getting to those coping skills. What's helping you survive, what's helping you get through these moments. These are the ways that I can be compassionate with myself today. Sometimes we can be really hard on ourselves when we're going through the grieving process. Support systems are so important when we're going through the grieving process. So help to look at, well, what do your support systems look like? And it's helpful when people, it can be a really lonely place to be grieving the loss of a loved one and or something in your life. And particularly with the loss of a loved one, it can feel very lonely. You can feel very isolated. And for a lot of people, it's kind of like taboo. Nobody wants to say anything because you don't know the right things to say. Well, what do you say? Nobody wants to say the wrong thing. And people are can be very uncomfortable around death or speaking about death, or they feel like, oh, well, if I bring it up, I don't want to make them sad. But then if I don't bring it up, I don't want them to feel that I'm not acknowledging it. So sometimes people just don't say anything. And so it really varies. So asking what's helpful. If you don't know what to say to other, I don't really know what to say, or that there's any right words right now. But what would be helpful for you, so kind of identifying, well, it's helpful when people do what for you. And so to help your support systems know what you need. People want to help, people want to be there for you, but they also sometimes just don't know exactly how to do it, or sometimes can be too overbearing and cross boundaries, which can also be difficult. Sometimes people can get their grieving process can get hijacked by others, or by other experiences. And so that's also difficult and can create a lot of anger, right? Because it's like, here I should be focusing on, on my grieving process to my loved one, but yet I have to divert my attention to this. And so that can create a lot of anger and frustration for people. And then memories, right? What are positive memories that we have of the person or the situation that we're losing? So these are all little prompts that you can use to kind of get you to that place, especially if you've been in the area of like resistance or avoiding or escaping. It's good to kind of start getting you reconnected to the loss and to the pain that you might have. With that, I wanted to just share that that EASE is available for all of you at Santa Monica College. We also not only support you as employees, but we also support your family members. So if you've had a significant loss in your family, the likelihood is that you're not the only one that's suffering. And so if you have children, if you have a partner, each person in your family is eligible for their own EASE benefit. And so feel free to reach out to us. Everything it's voluntary, it's confidential. Your supervisors, your HR, nobody will ever know that you reached out and obtained the services, or even so much as called. and ease for support. So it's very confidential and it's free. Your session is, your benefit is 3 sessions every 6 months. And we cover children up until the age of 26, and they don't need to be living with you in order to receive the services. EASE covers all LA County Office of Education now. We cover 80 school districts. We support 99 organizations. We support 5 community colleges. Santa Monica is one of the 5 community colleges that we support. Sorry about that. And so definitely a leader in the area of wellness and well-being for their employees, because there's not a lot of community colleges in the area that offer this benefit. So it's a very valuable benefit that not all community colleges offer for their employees. So we thank Santa Monica for being a leader in that area. So we offer unlimited access to telephonic counseling. This is 24/7. You or your family members can call to get support, or if you're having a really difficult time and just need someone to reach out to. Sometimes we don't want to talk to our family. We don't want to burden them. We feel like we're burdening them with what we're going through, or we just want it to be private. So that's when it could be helpful to talk to a third person, and so that's what our telephonic counseling is for. The individual counseling, and we also offer conjoint counseling. So this is, maybe you want to get counseling together as a family or as a couple to grieve a particular loss. So those are services that we can provide as well. We also offer face-to-face, more limited face-to-face options right now due to the pandemic, but we offer really expanded telehealth services. So with that, that concludes the presentation. I just wanted to, I have the last slide. I'll share it with you. I'll share all this with you, but our office number is there, and our EASE hotline number is there as well. So with that, I'm going to stop the slides and just kind of reach out to the chat box or see if anyone has any questions or feedback that they'd like to share. Thank you for all your comments in the chat. So helpful. Yes.
Looks like Matthew might have a question.
Sure. I don't see Matthew.
I think you're muted, Matthew.
Oh, Matthew. Yes, you're muted, Matthew. We can't hear you. Let me see.
Better?
Yep, that's
Okay,
better.
I've just started a group grieving process through Our House. And first one was last night. It was powerful, but I recommend it so far. It's been very good. So it's online and you have to pay. Well, it's a sliding scale for payment, but very well conceived, very thoughtful. It's private. It's what happens in this group stays in the group. So it's been helpful. I did it my own. So I recommend some kind of group or some kind of counseling. Absolutely.
Thanks, Matthew, for sharing. Yeah, our house is amazing.
Yeah.
They go to if anyone is interested, they should go to their website. They have just even a lot of resources on there, reading resources, but their groups are amazing. They're like the leaders in the area, and they also do a lot of support, like in schools with children, and they're also one of the leading places on training in working with grieving and people that are grieving. So thanks for sharing that. I highly recommend Our House as well, and so glad that that you're participating in a group, because it can be really
it's needed. It was I was a caregiver also, so I've got grief and caregiving recovery, and it's very hard. It's very hard. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing, Matthew.
Sure.
Lots coming in the chat. How do we get a recording of this? Yes, definitely. I'll be sharing everything with Cyrus, and he can be, I think everyone was registered, so you can share it to everyone that registered for this. And he'll be sharing the recording. Yes, the phone number for EASE is pasted on there. Thank you, Evelyn. That's our hotline number, which is 24/7. You can speak with the counselor. We don't have waiting lists. If you want to work with the counselor, you usually can get in with someone within a week. But our hotline, you can speak with the counselor 24/7. And the second numbers are office numbers. So those are during office hours. You can always call and speak to one of us here at the Ease office. And thank you so much for all the direct messages that I'm receiving. Yes, wish we would have taken advantage of this service at another time. Definitely. Thank you so much for everything that you're sharing. Yes, thank you. I see people are identifying with things that were said. If we had more time, we can dialogue more, and I'm sure things will resonate with each other. But like Matthew said, I definitely, there's healing in groups, and even just being with others that are in the process, even if you never say anything. So I just wanted to honor where each and every one of you are at in this process. And thank you so much for the time.
Hi, Dr. Hernandez. It's